Hello, and welcome to Caritas Querens, a channel for those who, in love, are seeking a richer relationship with the God who is love, who is relentlessly seeking the whole human race. My name is Brent Pottiger, and I am a practicing Roman Catholic with a background in Protestantism. And other than that, I'm a fairly ordinary guy. But over the last couple of years, especially, I have been really digging and seeking a deeper and richer relationship with God, our Heavenly Father, especially as a result of some crises that I have faced, one of which is going to be the topic of this series of videos. And I got to admit, I'm a little bit excited, but also a lot scared to address this because this is a very deep and sublime issue, and one about which there has been quite a bit of controversy over the years. It's one that I've done a lot of research in, a lot of prayer, a lot of meditation, and have not found a lot of very satisfying answers. And in fact, I've been very frustrated by that sometimes. It's caused me a lot of spiritual and intellectual and psychological pain and suffering. So I'm making these videos just to share some of the insights that I've gained. And hopefully, if you're going through the same thing, I can help you work through this a little bit and maybe find some light in this darkness. So the title of this series of videos, I anticipate this is going to be probably 3 or 4 fairly short, maybe 15, 20-minute videos. The title of this series is Who Determines Our Ultimate Destiny? So let me just break that down a little bit and explain why I titled it that. First of all, I'm calling it Who Determines Our Ultimate Destiny, not what determines, okay? And there's a reason for that, and that's because I think most Christians, at least most serious Christians, whether Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, pretty much agree that what determines our ultimate destiny is whether or not we have God's life in us, whether or not we have what is usually called, at least in the Catholic tradition, sanctifying grace. So I don't see a lot of disagreement there. I don't see a lot of controversy there. But where this does get a little bit confusing is who determines our ultimate destiny? In other words, who is it ultimately that kind of decides or makes the choices that result in our having grace, our having God's life, and thereby determining our ultimate destiny? Okay. Um, I guess you could say that almost all of the theories, all of the schools of thought on this basically break it down to one of two possibilities. Either it is God who determines our ultimate destiny, or it is man. It is we ourselves, as an individual, that determines our ultimate destiny. Okay, and a lot of schools of thought have sort of a mixture of the two. So maybe God determines our ultimate destiny in one course, in one track, and we determine our destiny in the other track, or or some kind of mixture of that. But very rarely, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen a really serious, cogent argument that says that somebody else determines our destiny, whether it be the devil or angels or other human beings, or certainly not any non-sentient being like a rock or or even a lower living thing like a tree or an animal or something like that. So, who determines our ultimate destiny? Okay, and also it's who determines our ultimate destiny. Okay, so I'm not looking here at who determines the choices we make on a day-to-day basis, who determines even who determines necessarily whether we have grace in the first place, whether we come to know God in the first place, but who determines our ultimate destiny. Okay, in other words, our permanent state after this life, after death. Again, I think that most Christian tradition is pretty much agreed that after death, that there's life after death, and that life will entail some state, okay, some permanent state, and that there may be alternatives. So usually, we would say heaven or hell, and even in the Catholic tradition, where we believe in a third purgatory, we say that is not permanent, but only transitory, and therefore it leads ultimately to heaven. So usually, we take that idea of two paths, two ultimate destinies, two ultimate permanent states after this life. Okay, and I'm not saying our eternal destiny either, and I'll tell you why later. I'll explain that later. We'll get into what eternal means, and some of the ramifications and implications of eternal, the word eternal. Okay, this whole idea, who determines our ultimate destiny, is tied in with a number of other doctrines, a number of other ideas. For instance, the idea of election. Election is just from a Latin word that means choice, okay, or choosing. So it involves the idea of election, which means ultimately that many schools of thought believe that God actually chooses certain people for salvation, for heaven. Also, the idea of predestination, which is kind of you could say almost a kind of branch off of election. The idea that God, before a person is even created, before a person dies, before a person achieves that ultimate destiny, that God has already destined them, has already chosen for them their ultimate destiny. Okay, and of course, this will touch on other issues like sin, free will, God's sovereignty, God's salvific will, and so on. So that's the topic of this series of videos: who determines our ultimate destiny? And as I said, this is a very controversial topic, um, although it's one that I think most people very rarely even think about. I spent, probably about 2 or 3 years really wrestling with this spiritually. And occasionally, when I would talk to some other people about this, people who are serious about their faith, serious about the spiritual life, often I got this impression, and I was even told by some of them, "Oh, it's not that big a deal. Why are you worried about this? You just live your life day to day, and don't worry about eschatology, about the end things. Don't worry about who's working behind the scenes. You know what you're supposed to do, and just do it day to day." Okay, so why is this so important? Why did I not just take that advice and say, yeah, I'll just live my day to day life and not worry about who determines my ultimate destiny? Well, I'm gonna share a few things that have occurred to me. Um, First of all, because although that advice, just live your day to day life, although that sounds very practical, I think that ultimately our answer to the question, who determines our ultimate destiny, does impact the way we live our lives, right? I mean, if for instance, if I were to truly believe um, some schools of thought that say that God basically predetermines who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, I honestly can't see why I would have any incentive or any serious reason to try to live a good, holy, moral life. I would think, well, if I'm already predetermined to go to hell, I may as well make the best of my time on earth before I go there, right? And if not, then that means I'm predetermined to go to heaven, in which case God has guaranteed I'm going to go there someday. So I can live a sinful and a life of sinful pleasures, and God will eventually bring me around. So it does definitely impact the way we live our lives. I'm not saying that I advocate that. Okay, living that kind of hedonistic life and thinking that God will bring me around if He wants to or something like that. But I'm saying if I truly believed that view, I think it would impact the way that I live my life. Another thing is that this question of who determines our ultimate destiny also impacts our view of God, and because it impacts our view of God, it also impacts our relation with Him. This is what really struck me in the heart, was as I started considering some of these ideas and looking into it and pondering it, I realized, wow, um, who is God? And if I believe certain schools of thought, if I believe certain approaches to this, then it really changes what God is like, who God is. And it kind of scared me actually for a while, and because I wanted to have a deeper and richer relationship with God, and I was seeing that it was becoming more and more difficult because the views that I just sort of held, that I just sort of accepted without thinking about them, in my opinion, led to a view of God that was kind of terrifying and not really the kind of God that I really would admire or wanted to have an intimate relationship with. This question as well is connected with a lot of other serious and significant truths, like I mentioned earlier, truths like sin and salvation, grace, free will, God's providence, God's will for us. All of those things are connected with this. And, I think of it as sort of like a contraption that has all kinds of parts or gears that are connected. Our understanding of one of those parts is connected to all the others. And so what we believe about this is going to ultimately affect what we believe about those other areas. So even though the answer to the question, who determines our ultimate destiny, might seem to be not immediately relevant, not very practical, it has ramifications on things that affect our day-to-day practical life, like our use of free will or our acceptance of God's grace. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, this question has been historically a very tangled knot. To give you just one sense of this, in the Catholic tradition, theologians from two opposing schools were really at odds about this for quite a while, and eventually the Pope intervened and founded what was called the Congregatio de Auxiliis, the congregation about helps, literally. In other words, this was a group of theologians that were to meet and discuss and try to come to some clarification and understanding about how God's help, how God's grace works with our free will, okay, and therefore, in a sense, who determines our ultimate destiny, right? How we get to heaven. And they met for, I think it was about 20 years. They had upwards of 80, I think like 85 conferences or meetings together to discuss this, discussions. And after all of that, they were still at an impasse. They were not able to get any resolution. Ultimately, the Pope, at the advice of several theologians, most noteworthy Saint Francis de Sales, a great saint, decided, well, we just have to let this go for now. And that's what he did. He closed the congregation and said that either side could defend their positions, and they could hold it as a possibility. They could not deny that the opponents' theories were also a possibility. But that was it. There was no resolution. And, I think it's kind of a shame, because this has been a source of real spiritual crisis, not only for myself, but for others, for many great saints. I think it was St. Teresa of Avila. When I was in the midst of this, I read something that she wrote where she talked about this. And I think she even made the assertion that almost all saints, who achieve that spiritual perfection, that they go through this crisis of trying to understand predestination and who determines our ultimate destiny. That being said, I am not by any means trying to insinuate that I am a saint or that I am very advanced in holiness. I don't think I am. But I'm just saying, just trying to point out that even those who are far more advanced than I am have had to struggle with this. And I think in a sense it can be kind of a shame. Not that their suffering has not been beneficial, but I wonder sometimes if really it's a crisis and it's a controversy that could be avoided if only we could attain to some greater light. Some might say, "Oh, yeah, but it's just that's the nature of mysteries." Theological mysteries, we can never fully understand them, and there's always got to be some shadow. There's always got to be some obscurity to it. It's like a great painting where there's that chiaroscuro. There's light and darkness that kind of balance out, or in a great symphony where there's times of silence and also times of beautiful sound, and sometimes there's beautiful sound, there's consonance, and sometimes there's dissonance. There's some lack of harmony, and you need that to make an ordered whole. Well, I guess that may be true, but our Lord Himself said, "The truth shall set you free." So it's not as if the truth is there to produce obscurity in our minds. The truth sets us free. So what am I saying? I guess what I'm saying is, just because there are controversies and just because there is some misunderstanding maybe or lack of understanding, ignorance, doesn't mean that we ought to perpetuate that we ought to just keep it going. Otherwise, we could go back to the early ages of the church and say, when they were wondering about the Trinity, is Jesus really truly the Son of God, or just some creature who's been perfected, or has a unique sharing in the life of the Father, or something like that. They should have just let that go and just kept that obscurity. Of course not. Nobody, I think, would say otherwise. That was a good thing that the church clarified, and we were able to understand who Christ is, who God as the Trinity is more clearly. It enables us to know him more fully and thereby to love him and follow him and have union with him, a deeper, more intimate relation and union with him. I believe the very same could happen with this as well. Okay, so anyway, so this first video, I'm just just an intro, okay, just talking about what this series is going to be about. And I also want to just really quickly explain how I'm going to approach this, okay? There are a number of ways that I could approach it. We could look at this historically and just sort of chronologically and say, okay, well, here's where this started to be discussed, and here are some of the major characters involved and the major schools of thought, and how this played out, and list all the years and everything like that. And I'm not going to do that. Maybe in the future I will. I don't know. I'm not saying that that's not useful, or that would be a bad way of approaching it. No, not at all. I think it's helpful to understand some of the historical background. That's just not the approach that I want to take in this video. I would like to keep it a little more simple than that and really try to approach it, I guess, a little bit more as just sort of an ordinary person, just trying to come to grips with the spiritual life and with relating to God. I'm not going to look at this theologically either. Obviously, in discussing this, some theology will have to be brought in and have to be accounted for. But I'm not going to get into all the theological nuances. A number of the schools of thought that I'm going to take a look at, obviously they're not cut and dry. Like, this, particular school means this exactly. There are different. There's kind of a whole spectrum of what this looks like even in each school. So we're not going to get into all of those gory details. Again, just kind of keeping it a little more simple and looking at the basic consequences of what we believe. I'm also not going to look at this from a strictly biblical perspective. Again, I think that can be a very useful thing to do, and definitely all of the schools that are out there, all the people who have written about this have drawn from the Bible and have found inspiration there, as have I. But I don't want to look at it just from that perspective. I kind of want to look at it, I would say, from the perspective of common sense. Okay. Now, what does common sense mean? Well, ordinarily we think of common sense as just, what makes sense to ordinary people, right? Sort of a democratic understanding of the way things are. So I do mean that. I do mean, how does this affect just ordinary believers who may not have studied theology or studied history or may not be biblical experts? But what does it mean to them, to somebody who's just trying to live the Christian life? But also common sense in a more philosophical understanding. It means taking all that we have sensed, all the things that we've gathered through our senses, our understanding, and kind of drawing it all together in common, and drawing conclusions from that. And that's also what I mean here when I talk about approaching this from the perspective of common sense. I want to just take a look at this issue, pulling a little bit from history, a little bit from theology, a little bit from the Bible, a little bit from my own experience, just see how it all ties together. Okay. So again, bottom line is, how does this affect the ordinary person, the ordinary Christian who's trying to live a good Christian life, trying to have a deeper and richer relationship with the Heavenly Father? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look in future videos at various theories on this topic. Not so much to evaluate and say, oh, well, this one is better in this area and this one's better in that area. I will probably do a little bit of that, but mostly just to kind of survey what other great minds have suggested about this. Okay, I think it would be kind of arrogant of me to just approach this from my own perspective entirely, without looking at what others have said. And in my own personal journey, my own personal experience, I have done that. I've studied what others have said. So I want to draw from them and see what have they said. And in my opinion, every school of thought that I've looked at has some things that I think are great insights and really help me to understand this more deeply. However, when I look at each one, I see what are the ramifications if we hold this theory. Take theory A. If I hold this and I really follow it to the T, what ramifications is it going to have in my life? And that's where I've started to see there are some problems. It just things just don't seem to work out the way that they ought to. And so, in all honesty, I just want to share what I have seen or noticed in that. Before we look at some of these schools, though, I want to start with just some basic principles that are definite. Okay, what do we actually know in this whole question of who determines our ultimate destiny? What do we actually know? Now, I'm approaching this from a Catholic perspective, and so these are things that the Catholic Church teaches dogmatically and teaches definitively. This is true. But even if you're not a Catholic, I would say, as far as I've seen and what I've read and talked with people and in my own experience, I think most non-Catholic Christians also believe that these are true as well. Okay, so I think these are just basic axioms, principles of the spiritual life, of theology, that probably like 99% of Christians agree on. Okay, so the first thing is God is the author of all good. Okay, that reminds me of the verse in the Epistle of James, that God is the giver of every good and perfect gift, right? So God is the author of all good. Okay, I think all Christians pretty much would agree on that. Second thing, man is the cause of sins. We are each the cause of our own unique individual sins that we commit, right? Third, God wills our salvation. And that salvation is really essentially union with him, having his life in us, sanctifying grace, a union of hearts and wills, loving him, being loved by him at the same time. And God wills that. God wants our salvation. That seems to be what St. Paul is telling Timothy as well when he says that that is the will of God, that God wills the salvation of all. Fourth, at the same time, man has free will, that we are truly free, which means that in some way we have a certain level of, I don't know if I want to call it autonomy, but we have a certain level of self-determination. Okay, this is a really thorny situation, and boy, I never really realized until I started looking at this how little I understood free will. I always thought it was very simple. Free will means I can decide to do whatever I want to do, right? Well, not exactly. So we'll take a look at that. But whatever free will actually means, it's pretty clear that we have free will, that man is not just a robot, that we are not creatures that act just completely on instinct, but that we have some part to play in working out our day-to-day life and our choices and perhaps even our eternal salvation. But what that means is that it is at the very least possible that a person might die without salvation if he has free will, right? So in other words, a person is not necessarily guaranteed to go one way or the other. Okay. Now these four basic principles: God is the author of all good, man is the cause of sins, God wills our salvation, which is union with him, and man has free will, and therefore it is possible at least that a person might die without salvation. These four seem to be pretty simple things that, again, I think almost all Christians would agree on. But when you start to ask how they all work together and how it all works out when you look at something like who determines our ultimate destiny, that's where it gets difficult. Reconciling these truths together, harmonizing them together. And that's what we're going to take a look at. So I hope you will join me in the upcoming videos as we take a look at this question: who is it that determines our ultimate destiny? And hopefully we'll find some light in this very dark and obscure theological question. Until next time, adios.